Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar session. My name is Amy Jones. I'm the Marketing and Communications Director at Save Your Skin Foundation. So I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar presentation titled Healthcare Systems in Canada, Where We Are Now. Now, this webinar will provide a broad overview of Canada's drug approval process, Health Canada, PMPRB, CADTH, and pCPA, with the objective of updating everyone on each of the organization's roles and current initiatives in making drugs available to Canadians. So this webinar is a primer for participants attending the November 13th to 14th Drug Pricing Policy Summit, Patients Redefining Health Care, and for anyone who would like to have a review of these systems just for their interest. Facilitating this discussion today will be Louise Binder, Health Policy Consultant for Save Your Skin Foundation. Now, just before we get started, I'd like to address a few little housekeeping pieces. Firstly, all participants in the audience for today's webinar will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the session. There will be a question and answer portion at the end of the presentation. You can see at the right-hand side of your screen in the webinar control panel, there's an option to type in a question. So please feel free to type in your questions here throughout the presentation, and we will do our best to answer them in the last segment. If there are any questions that do not get an immediate answer, we will contact you with a reply and any discussion you wish to have after the webinar. This session is being recorded and it will be available for replay on the Save Your Skin Foundation website in the next few days. The Save Your Skin website is saveyourskin.ca, and an email notification will be sent to everybody who registered with a link to the recording. So thank you again for joining us, and we will now begin the presentation. I'll hand it over to you now, Louise, to introduce our panelists who will be helping us understand today's topics. Go ahead.
Thank you, Amy. So good morning, afternoon, or evening to those of you who've joined us, depending on where you live. This is, as Amy said, a kind of a primer for the forthcoming Drug Pricing Policy Summit, which will be held in Toronto November 13th and 14th. If any of you haven't registered and would like to, we still have a bit of space left, although it's definitely filling up. The idea of today is just to make sure that everybody has some basic information about our healthcare systems in Canada, because they'll be the basis for our discussions at the summit. So it's a kind of where are we now? And I'm really thrilled that we've been able to attract three very knowledgeable speakers on these topics. So we'll be starting with Wayne Critchley, and he is he's a senior associate with Global Public Affairs, Health and Life Sciences practice. He provides counsel on biopharmaceutical companies, other health policy stakeholders, and previously comes with a lot of experience as the Executive Director of the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, Vice President of the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. So he's got a very wide experience, and he hails from Ottawa. So he'll be able to tell us all the exciting events there. And he'll speak specifically today on the role of Health Canada and the role of the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. And after we hear from Wayne, we'll be hearing from Heather Logan, who's presently the Vice President of Pharmaceutical Reviews at CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. She's responsible for work in the areas of pharmaceuticals, including the Common Drug Review and the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, as well as CADTH's Therapeutic Review and Optimal Use Products and Recommendations. In her role, she's working with Health Canada and PMPRB, as well as the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance and the Canadian Association of Provincial Cancer Agencies. And previously, she comes to us with a lot of experience through her work as the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Provincial Cancer Agencies. So thank you to Heather for giving us her time today. And last but not least, is Imran Ali. He's the Senior Manager of the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance office, and he's been there since September 2015. That office, well, he'll tell you more about it, but it's responsible for negotiation for the 14 public drug plan jurisdictions in Canada that are involved in joint negotiations with the pharmaceutical industry on prices for public drug plans. He also comes with a wealth of experience through his former position as the senior manager with the Agreements and Negotiations Units in the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care's negotiation branch. And so we're very pleased to have all three of them with us today. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Wayne, who will start the discussions with Health Canada.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Louise. And thank you, Louise and Amy, for putting on this webinar today and for providing me an opportunity to take part in it. I really appreciate it. I think these are very valuable and useful sessions, and I hope to make this as relevant as possible. I'm going to address issues related to the federal role in regulating pharmaceuticals. I'll move on to the next slide. Which sets out it's a bit of a reminder about roles and responsibilities in our federal system. The federal government has broad responsibilities in a number of areas, including the Food and Drugs Act, and in other framework laws and policies that impact the pharmaceutical sector, including the Patent Act. The federal government is also responsible for health benefits programs for Indigenous populations in Canada, and of course it provides funding to the provinces for the health systems. But the real delivery of health care is largely a provincial responsibility, including hospitals, health professionals, the public drug plans, except for those administered directly by the federal government. Public drug plans generally are managed and operated by provincial governments. So they're really the key player in delivery. We look at the next slide. It gives us a bit of a breakdown of where, how spending is allocated in Canada with respect to drugs. The Canadian Institute for Health Information reports that total spending on drugs last year was almost $40 billion. So it's a very significant chunk. And you'll see from that pie that it's really divided up quite equally in terms of spending by the public system through public drug plans, private drug plans, and out-of-pocket expenditures. But I would want to flag on that out-of-pocket expenditures that includes a lot of non-prescription drugs, over-the-counter medications that are typically not covered by public drug plans, or private plans for that matter. So this is looking at all drugs. And when you look at all drugs, in Canada, drugs account for about 16% of total health expenditures. That proportion has been unchanged for the last 10 to 15 years. It's about 16% of healthcare spending. But again, if we take out the out-of-pocket non-prescription drug spending, we find that the public drug programs themselves are spending less in terms of proportion. So in terms of the total government spending on healthcare, prescription drugs represents only 8.6% of their total program spending on health. So if we go to the next slide, this gives us an idea of all of the players involved in managing and delivering these programs. And on the extreme left, we have the federal programs, specifically Health Canada and PMPRB, that I'm going to speak about today, that apply across the board to everything in terms of drug programs. Above the line are the public agencies, including CADTH, that Heather will speak to, INES, the Quebec counterpart, pCPA, that Imran will speak to, and all of the provincial programs. And below the line are the private insurance programs that, as you know, are also important players in the delivery and funding of drug coverage in Canada. Moving to the next slide, I'll just sort of introduce the key elements of the role that Health Canada plays, and it's largely a regulatory role through the Food and Drugs Act and regulations that determine which drugs can be sold in Canada and under what conditions. There's much broader regulatory role, of course, medical devices, natural health products, and I could go on, but we're focusing today on prescription drugs. The next slide breaks that down a little bit more. So Health Canada approves all therapeutics products for sale. So that includes brand drugs, generic drugs, biologics, and biosimilars. And the standard that Health Canada uses, which is similar to standards used in other countries, is that the drugs must be safe, they must be effective, and they must be of good quality. And Health Canada assesses all drugs, reviews very significant amounts of scientific evidence to establish that those standards are met, and then it continues to monitor the products once they're on the market through a number of post-market surveillance activities. And those activities on the post-market surveillance, I think, represent an area where we've been seeing an expanded activity by the federal government in terms of the ongoing monitoring of the safety and efficacy of drugs that are on the marketplace. Squeezed in there, I have a bullet on the Special Access Program, which is a vehicle that exists that allows physicians and patients to obtain access to therapies that are not available in Canada, to bring them in from another country, ordinarily from the US. I'm not going to talk about that today, but that is an important program that patients, and especially patients who are trying to access new technologies not yet available here, or rare drugs, rare disease drugs, for example, that can be an important program. And moving on to the next slide. As I mentioned earlier, we're seeing a lot of movement in terms of the approach to the regulation of drugs and devices at the federal level. And Health Canada is engaged in a major regulatory modernization exercise, looking to develop more of a robust life cycle approach to regulation, to greater collaboration with the HTA bodies, the Health Technology Assessment bodies, CADTH and INESS, and to improve the access to drugs and devices, including biosimilars and generics, and while still, of course, ensuring maintaining the highest standards of safety and efficacy and the ability to make changes to a marketing approval based on new evidence that emerges as the drug is used in practice. This next slide is quite busy because it attempts to identify all of the various pillars of the regulatory modernization process underway at Health Canada. I'm not going to speak to all of these, but I did think it would be useful just to see how broad the scope is of this review. They call it R2D2. I've forgotten what that acronym stands for, but they call it R2D2, and it represents a major review by Health Canada. The key point I did want to look at is in the next slide on aligning drug reviews, and I think that Heather will probably elaborate on this a little bit more in her comments. But this was an initiative that was announced by the Federal Minister of Health about a year and a half ago to try and align the reviews by the HTA agencies more closely with the Health Canada review in an effort to streamline the process and speed up access to drugs at the end. And it was a response to the fact that previously the system had been very sequential. You'd get your marketing approval, then you'd go for an HTA review, then you'd go to negotiate prices. So this is an attempt to align those first two elements a little more closely in timing to speed things up. And the next slide provides a little more detail about that. I'm going to skip over this, and I hope Heather will have a minute or two to speak to it, but I'm just sensitive about the amount of time I'm taking here. Next slide, the 3 A's of federal pharmaceutical policy: affordability, accessibility, appropriate use. The government has made it very clear that it wants to work more closely with the provinces and is participating in the pCPA now. It wants to make drugs more affordable. It wants to lower prices. And of course, we now have the very significant study of PharmaCare. Not going to touch on that today, but that's all part of the federal initiatives. The next slide identifies some of the challenges that both federal government and public and private payers are facing. The question of lowering prices is a significant element of this. I think from a payer perspective, it's not so much prices perhaps though, as it is being prepared and flexible to be able to deal with the impact of new technologies, to be able to predict budgets and forecast expenditures to ensure that programs can be sustainable in the long term. And on back to the federal side, a real desire on the part of the feds to try and support and help those initiatives as much as possible. So in the next slide, I need to turn now to the Patent and Medicine Prices Review Board, fondly known as PMPRB, which is the federal body that is responsible for setting limits on the prices of patented drugs sold in Canada. It's been around for over 30 years now, was created as probably the first real attempt at price regulation for drugs in Canada at any level of government. Its mandate relates only to patented drugs because the federal government does not have any jurisdiction over pricing for generic or off-patented drugs. But it uses its authority under the Patent Act to regulate patented drugs. And the standard that it applies is that the prices should not be excessive. PMPRB is a quasi-judicial agency. It has powers I'm going to speak to in a moment. And the point I want to emphasize here is that it's a regulator. It's independent. It is not a payer. It does not deliver any drug programs. It does not cover or fund any drugs. It does not have a budget to do that. It is an independent regulator set up under the Patent Act to limit the activities or control the activities of patent holding companies to make sure that they act responsibly. The next slide, legal framework of the PMPRB, for a little more depth. I know when I was there, I would often hear critics say, oh, you're just a review board. That's all you do. Well, no, it's more than that. You could say that the name is a bit of a misnomer. The board is very much a regulatory board. It has, as I said earlier, it's a tribunal. It's a quasi-judicial agency. It has powers to order price reductions for drugs if they're found to be excessive. It can order offsets of twice excess revenues received. These are very tough penalties. But it is a very legal process, so that all its decisions can be appealed in the courts. Because of that fact, the PMPRB has always relied on attempting to encourage voluntary compliance by establishing clear guidelines of what it would consider to be excessive, so patentees can price their products accordingly. Next slide, some of the guiding principles of those guidelines based on the factors that are established in the Patent Act itself. And these include looking at prices in 7 other countries. The countries identified here are countries that are generally considered to be high and low-priced countries. It limits price increases to changes in the Consumer Price Index. Provides that most new drugs, that's almost all new drugs, cannot be priced any higher than the most expensive drug that's already on the market that treats the same disease. And Canadian prices can never be the highest internationally. The next slide, I think, in my view, shows that the PMPRB has achieved its objectives. Prices, in fact, declined 0.3% last year in Canada. They have never increased by more than CPI in the last 25 years. Canadian prices are 26% below the median of foreign prices, and Canada usually ranks in the middle of that basket of 7 countries in terms of prices. The board has obtained over 100 voluntary compliance undertakings, and it has collected just last year alone $35 million in excess revenues. So it has a track record. Nonetheless, in the next slide, there are many critics who say that Canadian prices may be fine relative to that basket of countries, but they're much higher than they are in some of the other European countries and members of the OECD. They say, why do you have the US as a comparator? The US is not an appropriate comparator. They say that our expenditures on drugs per capita are among the highest in the OECD countries, and that we should be changing the basket of countries. I would just make the comment that all of these arguments, which are on the table today, have been on the table for 25 years and have been reviewed in Parliament several times in the course of the last 25, 30 years, and government and Parliament have never chosen to act on them. However, looking at the next slide, we see that there have been many changes in the market since 1987. The biggest change from my perspective is that whereas the public drug programs virtually had no cost containment program policies at all when the PMPRB was established, today they do. And Heather and Imran will tell you about what they do. These are very extensive, very robust programs that work in many ways to control and moderate both prices and expenditures on drugs. Some people have said as a result of this, well, is the PMPRB even relevant today? And the first people to say that, and the people who say it the loudest, are the PMPRB themselves. And in their reports over the last few years, they have questioned their own relevance. This has led to their recommendations to the government to give them new powers and authorities so they can take a larger role in the Canadian drug pricing system. And last year, the government has announced plans to reform PMPRB and attempt to lower prices. Slide 19, and I'm almost near the end, just summarizes what those proposed reforms are. We'll change the basket of countries in order to aim for prices to drop to the median of OECD countries, to add new price factors, in particular pharmacoeconomics, which of course is health technology assessment, which is the tool used by CADTH in reviewing new drugs for formulary listing recommendations. And they want to take into account the confidential third-party rebates that are negotiated through pCPA with public and private drug programs. So the next slide is, well, it's the impact of this. It's very difficult to get a clear reading from the government on their estimates of the impact, but most people assume that we start with the assumption there'll be a reduction of at least 20 to 25% in list prices. And that's because the median of the OECD is about 20% below. And when Minister Philpott announced this plan, she said, we're going to save this amount of money in the health system. So that's the starting assumption. But when you add in the impact of applying health technology assessment to this, the potential impact is much, much greater than that. The biggest concern that I raise on this is the uncertainty that it creates. As Heather and Imran know very well, you don't know the final agreed upon health technology assessment of a drug before it comes on the market. So as a result, a manufacturer is going to be taking a very high risk when they bring the product on the market, and may go for several years before the PMPRB makes a determination. These determinations may ultimately have to go to court. The PMPRB has already obtained extra funding on the assumption that it will have more legal challenges. So these things will take a long time to become sorted out and established. And what's the impact of this then in the market? Well, the delays alone, the uncertainty alone, I believe will lead to significant delays in bringing new drugs to the market in Canada. It's too much business uncertainty for a global pharmaceutical company, and they may even decide not to launch at all. So the question is, what's the impact on patients if this is the case? So I'm going to leave it there. A couple more slides, but I'm going to leave it there because I've gone over my time. Be happy if there's time for questions at the end. Hello?
Louise, do we want to move on to Heather Logan?
Yes. Heather, would you take over? We'll put up your slide.
I would be delighted to. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Terrific. Well, listen, thank you very much, Louise and Amy, for the opportunity to join the webinar today with Wayne and Imran. We certainly are good colleagues, and I'm always intrigued to hear their presentations. And thank you for ending on such an interesting topic. It's the PMPRB is an area that has caused quite a controversy, and there's quite a range of debates happening. So I'd certainly encourage participants to learn more. So I've been given 10 minutes to talk about an organization that provides health technology assessment recommendations to the provinces and territories about both drugs and devices. I'm going to go fairly quickly because I know my colleague Imran, who's a terrific speaker and involved in lots of important work in the country, has a lot to share with you. So I'll go relatively quickly, and if you have questions and we have time, I'll answer them at the end, or you can reach out to me after the fact. Next slide, please. So just as a bit of background, I thought it would be important to really demonstrate, and you saw a little bit of this in one of Wayne's slides, the components of the drug system in Canada. So as he's already talked about very clearly, Health Canada has a role to determine the safety and efficacy and quality of manufacturing for new drugs in Canada. So there, as the regulator, have that role. Below that, and in parallel, CADTH and INESS. INESS is the parallel organization to CADTH in Quebec. And within the drug side of our organization only, we have the Common Drug Review, which is all non-cancer drugs, and the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, which is all oncology drugs minus supportive care drugs like anti-nauseants and other similar kinds of drugs. We conduct our HTA, or Health Technology Assessment reviews, separately and independently. We both have scientific committees and different processes, although we work very, very closely together, and release our own recommendations. CADTH releases recommendations to all provinces and territories except Quebec, and Quebec releases their recommendations to the province of Quebec. Below, after the work that happens at the HTA level by CADTH and INESS, is the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, and you've got the best speaker to talk to about that after me. In between the Health Technology Assessment and pCPA is a little yellow star, and it's called the Cancer Drug Implementation Advisory Committee. I won't talk about its function here, but it's really just to extend the work of the Health Technology Assessment Review and address implementation issues that couldn't be addressed because of insufficient scientific evidence. And of course, below that are ultimately what we're all here for, are for the federal and provincial ministries of health to approve drugs for Canadians so patients and clinicians have access. So that's, in a very, very fast summary, the drug system in Canada. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about CADTH. We are an organization that has a long history. We released a new strategic plan, and it was announced at the April CADTH Symposium this year in Nova Scotia. It signifies a continued evolution of CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, an evolution of our role from one that conducted health technology assessments on submissions from manufacturers or payers or tumor groups, which are expert clinicians within cancer programs across the country, to an organization that starts to look more at the life cycle of a drug. And what that means is we just don't make a recommendation and then move on to the next drug. We will think about how that drug lives and behaves once it's been approved in the system and whether there's a need to reassess the value of that drug, or potentially delist that drug or reinvest those resources in drugs that have much more promise in the system. So it's a life cycle approach rather than simply an HTA. You'll see in the strategic plan just a couple of things to call out for you. Our mission, credible scientific evidence, so we are science-based, and management strategies that enable the appropriate use of health technology, so both drugs and medical devices. And of course, in our new strategic plan, we have 3 strategic goals: to adopt this life cycle approach to the review and use of drugs, both cancer and non-cancer, and devices. Number 2, to anticipate a health system and health technology trends and develop agile management strategies. And what that means is moving from an organization that it really is doing very, very detailed work and trying to be much more responsive to the needs of the system in order to get these effective drugs into the hands of patients and clinicians. And also, of course, closing the gap between evidence, policy, and practice. So the time that we know something might be effective to the time that a patient has that, to try and tighten that gap as much as possible. Next slide, please. And I should have highlighted, but I think most people who have heard of CADTH know that probably one of the most notable values of CADTH is transparency. So everything that I'm going to talk about today, you can access on our website in one form or another. So in our 2018-19 strategic plan, which builds on our 3-year strategic plan, we have 5 priority areas. So just so that you have a sense of where we're going this year and what our priorities are. To really deliver a balanced portfolio of products and services is number 1. And we have a number of new and improved and enhanced offerings, including one which you'll probably hear a lot about over the course of the next year: reassessment and disinvestment. So developing a framework so that that's transparent and people have a chance to consult on and improve that process. 2, to establish processes to enable informed decision-making across the technology life cycle. And there's a number of activities that are happening within that particular priority area, but one that perhaps is most notable is collaboration with our partners. And when Louise introduced all of them: CAPTH, PMPRB, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, Health Canada. So really trying to make the system work more cohesively together. And I would say we've made tremendous strides in the last 12 to 18 months in that regard. And also to develop a framework for something called real-world evidence. And we just participated, we co-hosted a summit on Sunday this weekend with the Institute for Health Economics, Health Canada, and CADTH on real-world evidence to help us understand, as drugs become more personalized, so that evidence-based to make our recommendations on becomes less robust. And as we have new drugs that come into the system that we're not as certain about the value, but we'd like to put provide access to Canadians, but continue to monitor. That's real-world evidence and assessing the ongoing value while Canadians use those drugs. So there are 2 areas of priority for us this year. Number 3, to provide customized decision and implementation support. So the work that we do at CADTH is not useful unless it's adopted. And so I think the health technology funding recommendations are widely used. But to supplement that, we now have, and we have had for some time, but we're enhancing our capacity, our CADTH on the ground, so to speak, which are liaison officers and people that work with decision makers, clinicians, and other people and stakeholders in communities across Canada. And so we're increasing our on-the-ground presence, and we're introducing new implementation support teams across the country. Number 4, to expanded model for prioritization of evidence reviews. There, I'll just highlight a new medical devices advisory committee, similar to the advisory committees we have on the drug side. And then finally, strengthen our engagement with stakeholders. And for this audience, I think the most important, area of most interest is that we're establishing a patient advisory committee in this fiscal year. So there are priorities for this year that we're in, and I'll just go to the next slide. So if you don't know a lot about CADTH so far, there are a number of very well-known parts of the health technology process, and I'll cover them very quickly. Again, this is all available online. Of the 2 programs on the drug side, the Common Drug Review and the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, each of them have an expert review committee of clinical experts across a wide range of disease sites. So one for cancer, so different types of cancer, and SYSF as well. And on the non-cancer side, a group of clinicians who have a wide range of experience, and they actually review the evidence, review clinical input, think about what messages and requests they're getting from the payers, and make the final funding recommendation. So it isn't a CADTH recommendation, it's a CDEC or a PERC recommendation, and that stands for the Canadian Drug Expert Committee and the PayCoder Expert Review Committee, respectively. Each of them have a drug policy advisory committee to provide advice to CADTH about major strategic issues that are happening in this space and to help us refine and enhance our programs. And finally, each of them have a working group, the formulary working group, and the provincial advisory group. And these are people who are provincial drug plan leads in the provinces or in cancer programs that help to provide information about concerns or issues that need to be addressed in order for those drugs to be implemented. So those are well-standing, long-standing committees and serve us very well. Next slide. So when I was asked to present in 10 minutes, which I think I may almost have gone over already, they asked me to give me a couple of examples. So I thought I would give two, and one of them relates to some of Wayne's comments, and it was about this R2D2 project. So R2D2 stands for the Regulatory Review of Drugs and Devices. It was designed to provide more timely access to drugs and devices, so that in 2021, and there's a whole range of objectives for these projects, and there are 15 specific projects. I'll talk about one of them in a very high-level amount of information, is to explore the idea of joint reviews to increase efficiencies and expertise in the review process. So that's the one I'll speak about, but again, there are 15 total projects, and information about them is available on Health Canada's website. Next slide. So aligned review and HTA, so regulatory review and the health technology assessment. Prior to this process that Health Canada has implemented through R2D2, each of our reviews respectively happened largely independently and was a largely sequential review process. So the regulator would review and release a notice of compliance in order to give permission to license the drug in Canada, and then CADTH would take on the health technology assessment. And once we were done, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance would start the negotiation process. So the aligned review means that we now, if a manufacturer requests it, Health Canada and CADTH can run our reviews in parallel. So it's a significant difference in terms of timing, not only in terms of when our final recommendations are released, which means hopefully faster access to drugs for Canadians and for clinicians, but it also means that we have the ability now to share information between Health Canada and us, and between Health Canada and INESS. So 3 parties are participating, Health Canada, INESS, and CADTH. Again, this is a voluntary initiative. Manufacturers must request this when they submit documentation to Health Canada, and it is submission specific. So if they're submitting a drug for a particular breast cancer indication or a particular respiratory indication, their request for a voluntary review is only for that indication, that review, and they must request it again if they wish in the next review. So far, it was originally piloted by PCODER and a group called the Bureau of Metabolism, Oncology, and Reproductive Sciences at Health Canada. So it was a cancer pilot. We announced the changes in March of 2018. A webinar was held in September of this year to describe those changes, and you can read a little bit more about that online, and we had over 250 people registered for it. So it has become a really important lever to increase access, to timely access to drugs across Canada. Next slide. And I guess the second example I would give you is around biosimilars. So you will know that a biosimilar is a product that's highly similar and has essentially no clinically meaningful difference from existing products, either called the originator product or a variety of different terms. It's a Health Canada approved product, so that we didn't necessarily have to go through exactly the same process for a drug that was essentially identical. We have implemented a new process, which we consulted on in August of 2017. And that process now includes fewer submission requirements in the package, so the manufacturer doesn't have to spend as much time or energy in their submission to the Health Technology Review Body, CADTH or INESS. We have a limited review, by clinical and economic reviewers, so it isn't as expensive given the extensive review at Health Canada and given the fact that it is essentially identical to the other drugs, very, very similar with no clinical differences. There is no reimbursement recommendation, so neither of our expert committees, either CDEC or PERC, offer a funding recommendation. It is discussed at the advisory group level, and there's a dossier put together, and that dossier is made public on our website and shared with the payers so that negotiations can begin. So that process is intended to accelerate access to these drugs, which payers are interested in because of the potential cost savings to them in terms of offering drugs to Canadians. So I'm going to stop there. I know that was very fast, and I'll hand it over, I guess, to Louise or to Imran. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Imran, over to you to bring us home.
Excellent. Thank you. You can hear me, Louise?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Amy and Louise and the team at the Save Your Skin Foundation for the opportunity to speak here today with all of you. I think Wayne and Heather have done an excellent job, actually, of telling the story of drug approval and reimbursement landscape in Canada. So I think I can continue the story on from the very logical flow here to what the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance is and how it fits into this overall story as well. So the next slide there just talks a little bit about how the pCPA was established. There will be a couple slides from now where we'll kind of look at the overall timeline. But really, before the pCPA was formed, individual provinces, territories, and the federal drug plans did things differently when it came to covering drugs and paying for drugs. The jurisdictions, to put it simply, quite frankly, recognized that working collaboratively offered some room for improvement in terms of doing this work collectively. So the pCPA was introduced to accomplish some of the following issues that the jurisdictions were facing. Again, different coverage across the country, increasing budget costs and jurisdictions struggling with those as well. Differences in access and pricing across the country because different provinces would negotiate differently and implement product listing agreements, which are the confidential pricing agreements, differently as well. So all that said, the Conference of the Deputy Ministers approved kind of the formation of the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance to jointly and collaboratively approach the negotiation sphere together. So the next slide there talks about who exactly is the pCPA team. Seems like a simple question, but one worth kind of identifying here. So the pCPA is a collection and collaboration of all the public drug plans in Canada from all the provinces, territories, and as Wayne and Heather both mentioned, the federally administered drug plans as well. So you'll see that kind of on the top half of the slide there, represented there. And then the bottom half represents kind of my office and how we fit in as well. So the pCPA office was established in September 2015, and the office is in place to help the jurisdictions with this collaborative work. So all of these pieces together are what, when we say pCPA, it refers to both the centralized office that is managed here, as well as the provinces, territories, and the federal drug plans themselves, who are all involved collectively in the negotiation process. So the next slide is the actual timeline here. So there's a few things going on here, and I'll touch on each of them. One just kind of speaks to the evolution of governance. The second one kind of tells a little bit about the brand negotiation space, the brand drug product negotiation space. And then the third is about the generic drug negotiation space. So starting with the kind of governance story. So back in 2010, as I kind of briefly mentioned, the premiers of Canada got together and said, go forth and negotiate collectively. And that was really the instructions that were kind of and task that was given out to the public drug plans in Canada. So over the next many years, the public drug plans came together and kind of figured out how to do this joint negotiation activity. So over the course of those few years, a few products that would come through the HTA process, as Heather spoke to previously, the provinces and territories would get together and negotiate collectively on those. And that happened with increasing frequency over the years. Until a point in time in about 2014, you'll see the next kind of point on the slide there. An external consultant was brought in, IBM consultants, to kind of look at the overall alliance and say what's working well, what's not working so well, what could be improved. One of the things the IBM report identified was perhaps it's an appropriate time with the increasing kind of collaboration happening in this space to have some kind of a centralized and dedicated office that would support this activity. So from that came kind of the genesis or the idea for the pCPA office. And as I mentioned, in September 2015, the pCPA office was formed here to support the jurisdictions. A couple other things happened from a governance perspective shortly after that. You'll see the federal drug plans. First of all, Quebec joined the pCPA. A change in their kind of legislative environment allowed them to now also kind of partake in negotiating confidential pricing like the rest of the country. So Quebec joined the pCPA in October 2015, and then shortly thereafter in the new year, the federal drug plans also joined the pCPA, making it what it is now, which is a kind of representation of all the public drug plans in Canada. On the brand side of things, you'll see those are the kind of green boxes on the slide here as well. LOIs refers to letters of intent, which really is the end product of the pCPA process, which is the agreement. I think Wayne identified it as the kind of pricing and criteria conditions for funding. So the LOIs you'll see kind of tracked over time. We've just noted some significant milestones, round numbers of when 50 LOIs were reached, then 100, then 150. and bringing us to our kind of current point in time where there's over 200 LOIs that are now in place. You'll see they're kind of happening with increasing frequency, and as we run through kind of some of the numbers later, you'll see where that's coming from. And then the last thing on this slide here is the generic pricing as well. So you'll see that starts with the framework that was established with the CGPA, the association that represents generic pharmaceutical manufacturers, in 2014. And that really put into place this tiered pricing framework, which very briefly is a pricing predictability framework that is tied to the number of manufacturers in a space. So if there's one generic manufacturer, it's 75% of the brand price. If there's two, it's 50%. If there's three, it's 25%. So that's a very kind of simple summary of it. There's also a selection of molecules that are specifically priced, and those are the highest volume ones, which we'll talk about as well. So that framework was in place for a period of 3 years, and then you'll see kind of in 2017 a bridging agreement was reached, which extended the agreement under certain pricing conditions for a period of about a year, while the pCPA and CGPA negotiated the next phase of the generics initiative, which took effect in April of this last fiscal year. And there'll be some slides a little bit later on that we can go a little bit further into that. Next slide, please. I don't think I have to spend too much time on this one here. Very similar, hopefully, to what you've already seen from both Wayne and Heather. Another way of kind of looking at the overall landscape, starting at the federal level, and then to the HTA assessments, followed by the pCPA negotiations, and then finally the listing and funding at the jurisdictional level. Off to the side, you'll see a number of those areas that Wayne was able to talk to, PMPRB. Heather talked about the CDIAC. There's obviously patients and clinicians. There's other payers in the system, and that's probably not an all-inclusive dotted circle either. So all that to say, reiterating the point Wayne made, I think it's quite a rich environment of players. Next slide, please. So the pCPA's objectives are really, I won't read them all out here, but to kind of go briefly over the four, just as a touch point, it is about increasing access to clinically effective and cost-effective drug treatment options. So the top left is certainly about access. The bottom left is about lowering drug costs. That is one of the objectives of pCPA as well. The bottom right, just following it around, is about improving that consistency that may not have existed prior to the implementation of the pCPA. Again, not achieving absolute consistency necessarily, but the idea is to improve the consistency across Canada's different jurisdictions. And then finally, in the top right is the reducing the duplication and improving use of resources. So the idea of conducting negotiations once in a coordinated fashion rather than as individual provinces, territories, and federal drug plans. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about the governance. In just a couple years ago now, I guess almost 2 years ago, the pCPA did employ the help of an expert kind of consultant in the governance field, the Institute on Governance, to help formalize a little bit more of how the provinces and territories are working together. There was a recommendation and report issued, and the pCPA has begun implementing some of those governance mechanisms now to date. So at the bottom of the slide here, you'll see there is a governing council that is in place, which really is the assistant deputy minister level or equivalent across all the country. So one representative from each jurisdiction that kind of forms that governing council. Currently, this table is chaired by the ADM from the Ontario Drug Plan, so Suzanne McGurn, and vice chaired by the ADM in British Columbia, which is Mitch Moneo. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the challenges and opportunities, just to kind of keeping with the theme of where are we right now and what do we see going forward. So these are both challenges and opportunities, and I think they should be kind of seen as both. There is certainly, we'll get a little bit into the numbers here, but there is a challenge and an opportunity with respect to the current timelines for the pCPA negotiations and the fact that there are protracted negotiations. The second point there about there do continue to be affordability concerns still, even with the negotiated prices. The third one, I think a couple people have already talked about the real world evidence. Heather, I think you talked about the real world evidence and the kind of growing importance of that. And similarly, what are outcome and performance based agreements and how can those be fit into the system? The fourth bullet there is kind of about just specific types of drugs. So there are drugs for rare diseases, which kind of require a conversation on their own in certain respects. Heather mentioned also biosimilars, and we'll talk a little bit more about those as well. And then lastly, at the bottom is the idea about reassessing or kind of changing with the time, so to speak. So updating funding with new evidence as it continues to develop as well. So those are just an example of some of the both challenges and opportunities that the pCPA kind of sees going forward, at least in the near future. Next slide. We'll go into a little bit about the brand product negotiations. I'll try to go pretty quick through here, and so we can leave some time for some questions and discussion. Next slide. This is, again, the number of completed negotiations, 217 that you saw on the slide earlier. The savings estimate off to the right here, kind of it's simple methodology used to kind of estimate the impact of this negotiation activity. So currently you'll see that's considering all activity up until April 1st of 2018. So the new generics agreement is included in this number. It's almost about $2 billion in savings annually. Next slide, please. Here's a little bit of an idea about the activity of what happens at the pCPA. So we've talked about drugs going through this process. This should hopefully paint the picture of how many of those there are. As of the end of last month, you'll see that we have 56 ongoing negotiations, and there's another 13 products which are in consideration, which means they have their recommendation from the Health Technology Assessment Body, but pCPA has not yet initiated negotiations on those. So you'll see about 70 things in progress at the pCPA, so to speak. And then the table kind of gives you an idea of how that breaks out monthly. So you'll see over the course of the last 12 months, 60 HTA recommendations came forth. pCPA engaged in 74 new negotiations, and pCPA closed 69 negotiations. Now, important to note, those aren't, it doesn't follow it through, so it's not necessarily saying the new recommendations that came out were then engaged and then were then closed. It's simply looking kind of at an aggregate level of each of those categories. Next slide, please. So don't get intimidated by this slide. This was kind of the brand process guidelines are kind of a response to the need for more transparency around the pCPA process. This diagram that you'll see in front of you is part of a larger document that explains in more detail how the pCPA actually negotiates. So it's broken into kind of 4 very simple phases here. The gray part at the top kind of picks up the story where Heather left it with the final HTA recommendation. Then you'll see the kind of blue bar there is it's called initiation, where pCPA picks up the file. Phase 2, the orange place, is the consideration. So this is the area where the provinces, territories, and the federal drug plans work together with the support of the office to kind of collectively establish the objectives for a negotiation. You'll see coming out of the orange bar, there's either the decision to negotiate, at which point you enter into active negotiations, or there could be a decision to not negotiate. A lot of times, for example, that might be dealing with a negative HTA recommendation. But when you are in the active negotiations, that green bar there is quite simply depicted as an exchange of proposals and counter proposals between a pCPA lead who has been identified to act on behalf of all the jurisdictions. So that could be, in some cases it might be Alberta, in some cases it might be Saskatchewan, in some cases it could be a combination of provinces, in some cases it might be my office as well. But the point is that pCPA lead is kind of the point of contact with an individual manufacturer of a drug for the purpose of negotiation. And then finally, coming out of that is the what I spoke to about if terms are reached, you get a letter of intent, and then that letter of intent kind of flows down to the bottom grayed out part, which is the product listing agreements, which are then entered into by each jurisdiction according to those LOI terms. So that's not a separate negotiation, but it is taking the kind of pricing and criteria conditions that have been negotiated by pCPA and translating them into the jurisdictional level contractual obligation to fund. Next slide, please. So I won't go too much into this, but these LOIs can look like very different things, and these are not all mutually exclusive. The elements you're seeing on here, oftentimes an LOI will include multiple parts of this, but there can be many ways to kind of have these confidential pricing agreements. The most common is probably the $1 rebate, which means X% off the price of a drug. There are other ways to do it, having caps, hard caps, soft caps, there's free goods. The bottom right one there talks about outcome or performance-based. We could probably spend an hour just talking about that. So I won't get too much into it, but just to say there are a number of kind of outcomes and contracting tools that are available to kind of achieve the value for manufacturers to deliver the value that's needed by pCPA to proceed to listing. Next slide, please. So again, very quickly, timeline measures. So the question might be coming up, how long does this pCPA negotiations process take in light of the other parts of the system as well? So you'll see, looking at the 67 files that were closed in the last fiscal year, so just taking a sample of that year, you'll see the median, that's probably the most relevant number to look at there, is about 10 months. So again, to be clear, that's from the time CADTH or INS would issue a final recommendation to the time that pCPA would enter an LOI, is about 10 months. The next kind of middle part of the slide here talks about those 56 files I talked about that are in current actively being negotiated. What's it looking like on those? Of course, the deal has not been reached or not reached in those cases. So the timeline on those 56 right now is about 8 months, you'll see, 7.8 there. And then finally, those 13 that have not yet entered the active negotiation but have their HTA recommendation, the timeline on those is about 2 months as well. Next slide, please. So there are timeline targets included in that process guidelines document that I referred to earlier. You'll see there is a kind of a number of business days associated with each phase of the negotiation process that has been identified. Important to note that these are aspirational. You'll see if you add up kind of from phase 1, 2, 3, 4 throughout, it adds up to about a target of 6 months for the negotiation process. So compare that to the about 10 months that we're measuring right now. So definitely are aspirational targets, but the pCPA as a collective did feel this is kind of a first important step to make, is to set out some targets and try to achieve them, and then kind of measure and see where we can go from there and understand the reasons for variation. Part of that, the bottom part of the slide there does speak to the fact that there is an acknowledgement that phase 3 specifically, the active negotiation phase, is a two-party kind of process and does involve the pCPA lead working with the manufacturing party as well. So there is definitely a kind of joint responsibility for those timelines there. Next slide, please. So on the generics initiative, next slide again. I talked about this, so I won't spend too much time on it, but the slide kind of summarizes the first framework agreement that was reached. You'll see the end of the last kind of box on the right there speaks to the bridging agreement. Really, the end result of this was you had 18 of the probably most commonly prescribed and used drugs priced at about 18% of the brand price. So this is in addition to that framework, the tiered pricing framework that I talked to. Next slide, please. Talks about this is the new agreement that's been reached effective this April. So it is a 5-year agreement. You'll see the kind of summary of that is now, instead of 18 drugs being at 18% or so, you have about 70 drugs being priced anywhere from about 10 to 18%. So again, the number of drugs has significantly gone up, but that's kind of in recognition also of as you kind of use more and more less prescribed drugs, you need more of them to come up with the kind of required value that the pCPA had set out. Next slide, please. Okay, biosimilars. We'll end on this one here. So I won't go through this here, but there is kind of a number of reasons for pCPA's recent focus on biosimilars and biologics. Not the least of which is it's a pretty significant area of spend within the drug portfolio, and Canada is quite different from many other parts of the world with respect to the uptake of biosimilars as well. And you'll see the last bullet speaks to some PMPRB estimates that have been put out about the potential for additional savings that can then kind of create the room for drug plans to continue to be able to afford and fund new innovative products as well. Next slide, please. So the pCPA back in April 2016 released some first principles on biosimilars as the first product started to come to the Canadian market. Next slide, please. the industry, the pharmaceutical industry, that is, kind of responded to the first principles with some common themes that you can see identified there. Importantly, what came from this was that pCPA recognized the need to kind of further define the negotiation space with the industry stakeholders and partners, but also recognizing very explicitly that patients, providers, and other payers need to also be engaged, perhaps separately, with respect to an appropriate uptake of biosimilars. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of the 8 or so indications and biosimilars that have been negotiated to date or are currently being negotiated in the case of Lepelga at the very end there. Next slide, please. The next slide speaks to some of the objectives in the biologics and biosimilar space. And then the next slide, which we can kind of focus a little bit on, is the most recent kind of development in this space, which is the pCPA, further to the first principles, has come out with these following 8 statements, which I won't read out specifically, but these are kind of the framework for policy directions going forward. So this was the need to clarify the negotiating space with industry manufacturers more clearly, and these 8 statements are meant to kind of help clarify that space a little bit more. And then next slide should be my last one, I believe. Priorities. So there are kind of aside from the specifics here, the pCPA as an entity and as a collective is kind of focused on using these kind of 5 metrics in order to define where we want the evolution of the entity to go. One is definitely transparency. So I think the brand process guidelines you saw were definitely kind of a direct output of the need to kind of demonstrate how does the work happen in pCPA. Measurement, I think you're seeing as well in terms of how well we do work. There are definite timeline targets associated with the process. Sorting is the acknowledgement that maybe the current way and the volume of activity that's there, like we talked about, 56 or so active negotiations. Obviously, all the drugs are different, have their own stories, have their own kind of considerations. Is there a way to differently handle different types of drugs as well? Engagement, that's an important one as well. So pCPA spent a lot of its time formation kind of working to figure out how to work with one another, the provinces, territories, and the federal government. And now at this point in time, it seems like we're well positioned to kind of do a little bit more formal engagement with our external stakeholder partners, including patients, clinicians, the pharmaceutical industry as well. So you should be seeing more of those types of activities as well. And then finally on capacity, about over a year ago, probably the federal minister did kind of announced the investment of further funding to kind of support and the pCPA activity. So with that increased capacity, how can our workflow evolve as well? And I know we're a couple minutes over, Louise, but I'll stop there and maybe we can leave some time for some questions.
Thank you to all of you. Amy, do we have any questions?
We do have 3 questions, so we'll just start with the first here. With the new US, Mexico, Canada trade agreement, patent for biologic has been extended. Will that delay the entry of biosimilars into Canada, i.e. delayed access to cheaper medication for Canadians? And will there be ways to address that delay even though the approval process is more streamlined in Canada?
Perhaps I can start on that one, Amy. It's Wayne here. First of all, my understanding is that the extension from 8 to 10 years is for data protection, which is also relevant. It's not the patent, it's relevant to market exclusivity, but it will only apply to new products. So the impact of that new provision will not be felt for at least another decade and maybe 2 decades. So that's kind of the first point on that. But yes, it will provide exclusivity, a longer exclusivity period under the data protection provisions which currently exist.
Great, thank you very much for that, Wayne. Let's move on to the next question. In a June 22nd, 2018 paper on health technology assessment for drugs for rare diseases, CADTH demonstrated that Canada as a country lacks a comprehensive rare disease framework and processes for evaluating drugs for rare disease. CADTH, unlike any of the jurisdictions reviewed in the report, does not have a definition of rare diseases. Why does a body that lacks the capacity to evaluate drugs for rare diseases, which in some cases makes decisions that could mean life or death for some people with rare diseases, continue to evaluate drugs without a rare disease framework?
So, Amy, I'm assuming you're directing the question to me?
Yes, Heather or Louise, if you prefer to jump in, but Heather, if you're comfortable answering that, that would be great.
I would be happy to offer some thoughts, and then obviously Louise will have lots to add. So that is true. We are in a different state, I think, now. Many of you may have heard or will hear soon that we have, there is some work happening with several jurisdictions across Canada to really, in recognition of some of the issues that people are facing, both at the health technology assessment level, but also at the regulatory and the payer level, in dealing with drugs that are for small populations, which therefore is often associated, not always, but often associated with evidence that is much weaker, smaller trials, smaller number of patients, less confidence in the outcomes than what we would typically put through either a regulatory or an HTU process and result in a positive recommendation or a funding recommendation. And so there is a recognition in the system right now and some work happening to try and find a way to deal with those drugs and to ensure that we have a provision to review appropriately and to make prudent recommendations to provide patients with access, knowing, however, though, with that high degree of uncertainty and often very high cost associated with those drugs, that we need, the system needs, Canadians deserve reassurance that the value that is promised is actually being delivered and is therefore worth the expense that's being paid, and the trade-offs that frankly have to be made in other parts of the system in order to fund many of these different emerging technologies in healthcare. And so we are in a different space now than even a year ago. And I think that some of the discussion that perhaps had happened 2 or 3 years ago, some will remain relevant, but I think it's almost like the discussion has taken on a very different flavor, and I think things will look different potentially in the future, obviously with input from patients, clinicians, industry, and other stakeholders, but we're in a different point now. So I'm just going to leave it there, and I will unfortunately have to say, I have to disconnect. I apologize to everybody on the phone. I did not know this meeting would extend past 1 o'clock. I am accessible. If you'd like to ask questions, Louise or Amy can make sure you have my contact information. But thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Heather, and sorry to keep you over the hour.
No problem. Take care, everybody.
We do have one more question, which I think is probably best answered by Imran. Let me know. I'll ask the question, and Louise, you can kind of decide. Under pCPA, you had a slide that showed 13 cases were transferred to provinces for individual negotiation. Why would a drug be transferred to province to negotiate, and what kind of drugs would fall within this category?
That's a great question. Yeah, I can certainly answer it. So it is on that the pie chart that we went through quickly. I think the question's coming from the one that showed there are 217 joint negotiations joint agreements reached. There was another 54 cases where negotiations were not pursued by pCPA. Again, the majority of those would be negative HTA recommendations. There was another 27 where pCPA did enter into negotiations with a manufacturer. However, terms were not reached, so the outcome of that would be no agreement. And then finally, that last piece of the pie, which is what the question is about, is the 13, which was the decision to negotiate by individual jurisdiction. So I'll say this once, maybe slowly, but it was in these 13 cases, they are all historic. I think more than 3 years old since that number has changed. But it was a collective decision by the jurisdictions to individually negotiate. So still a collective decision. The kind of characteristics of those, I'd have to go back and kind of refresh my memory, but very simply put, those 13 cases probably involved situations where existing confidential agreements across the provinces were such that doing a joint negotiation was not feasible. So again, the collective would have decided that in these 13 cases, it doesn't make sense for the pCPA and jurisdictions to try and approach this collectively. Therefore, each individual jurisdiction should go forth and negotiate on that. And again, that number hasn't changed for at least 3 years, I believe. So a lot of those are kind of historic and deal with the environment and that inconsistent environment that kind of existed prior to the establishment of pCPA.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Imran. And actually, that is the end of our questions. So I'll hand it over to you, Louise, for any final comments.
Thank you. Thank you all for staying on the line past the hour. It just shows that this is a very, very interested group, and that the topics are very complex and hard to really cover in 10 minutes. I just wanted to say one thing on the rare diseases, and I'm sorry Heather isn't here to hear this, but I think, the problem, if I think it's a problem, and the issue is really one that no one agency can tackle. I think that unless we get real leadership from our governments about their views on rare diseases, and the fact that we do need a proper framework and policies, and probably some legal framework too on rare diseases. It's really tough for any one agency or even group of agencies to know kind of what their role is here. So I really hope that the federal and provincial governments are going to determine how to lead us all through this rare disease issue, which we need desperately guidance on. And just then to say thank you to all of you for attending. If you do have further questions or comments, don't hesitate to send them in. If you want to direct them to anybody in particular, we'll make sure that we get an answer. And again, thank you so much to our presenters for taking the time today. So that ends our webinar.
Great. Thank you very much. And just a reminder, this presentation will be available online at saveyourskin.ca in the next few days. If there are additional questions, just please send them to myself at amy@saveyourskin.ca. Thank you for joining, and this ends our webinar session.